it's a little unfair on Cynthia, really, but it's sort of using her as a character to demonstrate that John is on this path.
Yes.
He's going to. There's a line in it. Is that he's going to.
He wants the world.
He wants the world. Exactly.
So what do you want, Cynthia? And Cynthia says, "I want like big house. I want kids, but really all I want is John."
Yeah.
And Astrid says, "John wants the world."
Yes. Yeah.
And that bugs me a little bit because I have a real problem with this kind of biopic.
Yeah.
Where they do this kind of clumsy foreshadowing.
Yes.
So when it's really like this lighthouse scene and the beach scene and stuff, where a lot of that occurs, where Astrid asks John, "What will you do when you're rich and famous?"
Yeah.
And this idea of John wanting the world and stuff, and those are lines that are written with hindsight, obviously in hindsight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're a way to get the character now to the John character now to comment on what we know he will later become.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel natural to me. It feels like you wouldn't say that in real life. Because I don't go around telling my friends that this guy that I know is destined for greatness. That might just be down to who I hang out with. Maybe I need to choose better friends. But in general, you don't really know that those things are happening.
Yeah. You don't say that to people about me? I mean, to be fair enough, I'm in my early 40s. If it was going to happen, it would happen already.
I told many people you're destined for greatness in your 60s. As what we've known it. I think the word I used was notoriety.
Yes, I think that's fair. Yeah, I'll say something horribly controversial on this podcast and get cancelled for it.
That's 100% what's going to happen.
That's my path to glory.
But do you know what I mean? I feel like there are scenes. Any kind of film like this has a responsibility to tell broadly what was accurate at the time,
mm-hmm.
but without not at the expense of telling a good story, obviously.
Yeah.
And then there are these moments where it feels a little bit self-indulgent because it's the director or the writer saying, we can just have a moment here where we get to comment on the fact about how brilliant or how famous and what a genius this person's going to become. We get to talk about that bit now.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really serve either of those two previous points.
Yeah. People, I forget who it was, but there was an interview of someone who'd seen them at the Cavern. It was maybe Jerry Marsden or someone like that. But someone who was sort of part of that scene and had seen them at the Cavern, and they were doing the interview, the contemporary interview, and they said, so did you think they'd be the biggest thing in the world? And most people say, I could tell they were just going to be the best thing in the world. It's the stock answer. And this, maybe it wasn't Jerry Marsden, but whoever it was said, no, I thought they were really good bands, but no, like you can't. Yeah. There's no way you can imagine that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a good and honest answer.
Yeah,
I mean, in terms of the sort of foreshadowing thing, I mean, there are lines in it that are dropped in. Someone mentioned, John says, "Oh, it's been a hard day's night," and Stuart says, "I've been working 8 days a week,"
mm-hmm.
and George says his line from Hard Day's Night. Oh, by all means, I'd be quite prepared for that eventuality.
Oh, yes, it is good. Yeah,
which is like, and obviously no one is saying, oh yeah, this is a thing that they said back then and then was written into Hard Day's Night. It's just a nice little Easter egg. It's fan service, really. It's a nice little flourish.
Yes, yeah.
And I do agree with. I always get the same feeling about biopics as well. It's like, in order to satisfy the audience, they have to do this sort of foreshadowing thing of how great this person's going to be, where actually nobody at the time can really tell.
Yeah.
And also there was it's especially weird that people are saying that because there was no precedent whatsoever other than maybe Elvis. But Elvis was just a one-off as far as everyone was concerned. Nobody was thinking like who's going to be the next Elvis. This is now a thing. There are going to be rock and roll artists who get mega big because it was just seen as a fad at the time. There was nobody. If this was kind of set in the 70s, anytime from the 70s onward, at least there was a precedent for, this band is really talented, they're going to be massive.
Yeah, it's a really good point, yeah.
The idea of anyone saying that about the Beatles when they were in Hamburg is just like, no, these guys are really good and I like watching them play in clubs.
Yeah.
There was no I mean, nobody even had heard any of the songs they'd written themselves. You know?
Yeah.
There's no way to predict that.
Buddy Holly and the Crickets? Is that about as close as it? Because obviously they're called the Beatles at this point, aren't they?
Yeah.
They've got that name by riffing on the Crickets.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe. But it's still Buddy Holly, right? I guess. It's still,
Right.
yeah, you're right.